A man stood in Havana, writing under the assumption that time had already run out. Outside, Cuba waited for invasion. American warships ringed the island. Reconnaissance aircraft crossed the sky. Military units dug in along the coast, preparing for a landing that seemed inevitable. It is October 1962. The world is holding its breath. US and Soviet tensions have reached their absolute peak, and at the center of it all sits a tiny Caribbean island that most people assumed was just a pawn on a superpower chessboard. But what if I told you the real danger wasn't in Washington or Moscow? What if the glitch, the hidden fault in the system that nearly caused global nuclear war, was something no one in either capital fully understood until it was almost too late? This is the story they don't teach in school. The story of Cuba's secret nuclear brinksmanship and the terrifying moments when the fate of the world rested not with presidents or premiers, but with a handful of desperate men convinced they had nothing left to lose. Fidel Castro believed the decision had already been made in Washington. He believed the United States would invade Cuba within days, and if that happened, he believed the war would not remain conventional. Castro had watched the buildup closely. The missiles on Cuban soil were not symbolic, they were operational. Soviet medium and intermediate range nuclear weapons capable of reaching much of the continental United States. These weren't props in a political theater. Crews trained under extreme pressure, security tightened, communications narrowed. The weapons were real, the threat was real. And what made it all so extraordinarily dangerous was a single critical detail. Cuba did not control the missiles. Moscow did. How did nuclear weapons arrive on Cuban soil without the United States detecting them in time? The answer reveals one of the most audacious covert operations in Cold War history and a breathtaking failure of American intelligence. Khrushchev's desperate play to alter the global power balance had worked, at least for now. Hidden beneath jungle canopy, photographed from 70,000 feet by cameras mounted on aircraft so fragile they couldn't be armed to defend themselves. The secret was out, but what happened next, that's where the real glitch begins. Here is what most histories leave out. At the height of the crisis, 4 Soviet submarines were operating in the waters around Cuba. Each one carried a nuclear torpedo. Each torpedo had the explosive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. They were operating independently, cut off from Moscow, unable to surface without risking detection. Their commanders were under orders that gave them terrifying discretion. If attacked, if contact with command was lost, they were authorized to make their own decision. On October 27th, the single most dangerous day in human history, one of those submarines, B-59, was depth-charged by American destroyers. The crew had been out of contact with Moscow for days. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed war had already started. He gave the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo. 2 officers agreed. 1 did not. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. He was the flotilla commander aboard B-59, and under Soviet protocol, all 3 senior officers had to agree for the weapon to be fired. Arkhipov refused. He argued. He held firm. He persuaded Savitsky to surface and await orders. The torpedo was not fired. You are alive because of that refusal. But here is the deeper glitch, the one that almost no one talks about. Castro understood his limitation. He did not control the missiles. Moscow did. And yet, as the crisis reached its most dangerous hour, he made a request that went far beyond Cuban sovereignty. He wrote to the Soviet leadership with a blunt assessment. An American invasion, he warned, would mean the end of the Cuban Revolution. There would be no second chance. If U.S. forces landed, Castro urged the Soviet Union not to hesitate. The missiles should be used first. A preemptive nuclear strike, not as retaliation, not as deterrence, as an opening move. the message crossed the Atlantic at the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. In Moscow, leaders were already under strain. Soviet ships were approaching the American naval quarantine. Communications with Washington were fragile. Miscalculation was a constant risk. Castro's letter landed in the Kremlin like a shock. This was the glitch. Not a computer error, not a radar malfunction. A human being, under unbearable pressure, convinced the worst was inevitable and deciding that if the end was coming anyway, it might as well come on his terms. Faulty intelligence, delayed messages, misinterpretations amplified at every level. The command chain, the thing that was supposed to prevent accidental nuclear war, had fractured, and nobody in Washington or Moscow fully knew how badly until years later when the classified documents finally surfaced. Fear, pressure, individual decisions, these were the real variables, not the missiles, not the warships, the people holding the trigger and what they believed in those final desperate hours. To the Soviet leadership, Castro's proposal was not defiance, it was desperation. And it was unacceptable. The idea of launching nuclear weapons first, especially in defense of a small island, was viewed as suicidal. Such an act would guarantee total war, not escalation, not negotiation, annihilation. Moscow had placed the missiles in Cuba to alter the strategic balance, not to trigger the end of the world. The deployment was meant to be controlled, reversible, political. Castro's proposal shattered that assumption. For the first time, Soviet leaders confronted the reality that the crisis was not entirely in their hands. The host country, the front line, was prepared to burn with the weapons it did not command. The response from Moscow was firm. There would be no first strike. The missiles would not be used unless the Soviet Union itself was attacked. Cuba was not informed of every detail. Trust frayed. Castro felt sidelined, exposed, and expendable. The weapons on his soil were governed by decisions made thousands of kilometers away. As negotiations between Washington and Moscow intensified, Havana was largely excluded. The fate of Cuba was being decided without Cuban participation. When the crisis ended, the missiles were withdrawn. The invasion never came, but the letter remained. The Cuban Missile Crisis reshaped nuclear diplomacy forever. In its immediate aftermath, the leaders of the two most powerful nations on Earth looked at what had almost happened, and they were terrified. The Moscow-Washington hotline was established in 1963, not because of a close call at the negotiating table, because of a close call in a submarine, because of a letter no one was supposed to see, because of all the glitches, human and mechanical, that had nearly slipped past every safeguard. The crisis revealed a lesson that military and political planners had refused to fully accept. In nuclear conflict, the most dangerous variable is not the weapon, it's the person holding it, their fear, their information, their certainty that the worst is already happening. And here is why that matters today. The nuclear powers of the 21st century face many of the same fault lines: communication gaps, proxy conflicts, leaders under pressure making decisions with incomplete information. The glitch that almost ended the world in 1962 was not a unique historical accident. It was a template. Nuclear war was avoided not only by restraint in Washington and Moscow, but by refusal. A refusal to follow an order born of certainty that the worst was inevitable. A submarine officer who said no, a superpower that said no. Thin margins, quiet moments, small decisions with infinite consequences. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often remembered as a contest between superpowers, but for a brief, terrifying moment, the greatest risk came from the smallest player, standing at the center of the storm, convinced that survival demanded the unthinkable. We didn't dodge a bullet in October 1962. We dodged 1,000 of them, and most of us never knew any of their names.
If you like more stories like this, you can find more in the playlist. Hit like if this changed how you see the crisis. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging into the archives. See you next time.